Hello and welcome to this session for the Global Walkability Correspondents Network. Today's session features Ann Bueche. She's a member of the Global Walkability Correspondents Network, GWCN, and joining from Royal Oak, Michigan, Metro Detroit, USA. Ann serves on her municipality's planning commission and sustainability and climate action task force. Today's session features Ann and is titled Walking Starts at My Front Door, Lessons Learned About Walkability Living in 15 Different Cities. And I just want to say thank you for being part of the network. And I'm very excited about this session. I have a feeling we're about to embark on a very interesting global journey. So thank you.
Thanks, Annika, very much for the introduction and the invitation. And I really appreciated being part of the network and watching it grow, and also increasing all of our advocacy for walkability in the various places that we are. And welcome to everybody for joining today. And I hope this information is useful to you. And I invite you, as I walk through my presentation, to think about places that or points that might resonate with where you are now or where you've lived in the past. And I will look forward to hearing your comments and observations at the end, and I may stop once or twice in between just to see if there's comments, but otherwise I'll go through and then we'll have a discussion at the end, and I look forward to your input because I value very highly participating together. Whoops, and let's see if I know how to use this kind of thing. Wait. How do I make sure the slide goes forward? Oh, there it goes. Okay, to start out, I wanted to make a land acknowledgement that where I reside now and where I grew up here in Michigan is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe people, which includes the Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. I find it very important to make that acknowledgement, especially as we look at how we need to do better at caretaking of the climate and the planet. And so I wanted to point that out and express my appreciation for the people and for their caretaking of Michigan, which was clear-cut in the Lower Peninsula after colonization. I want to point out here on this map that the Saginaw Trail happens to be a footpath that goes from the waterfront in where today's Detroit is up to through Royal Oak, where I live now, and up to Saginaw, where I grew up. And so that footpath, which is today Woodward Avenue, which is Highway 1 in Michigan, has an important significance for me because I've lived along it quite a long time, and I find it an interesting connection between different places I've lived. The places I'm going to talk about today, I am an international development consultant as well as an advocate for walkability and ecological restoration, and I have worked in many other places, but these are the 15 places I decided to include here as places I lived full time. And that means I lived, in an apartment or a house and that kind of thing. And I had my daily duties in terms of either, in some cases, studies, but most of it working. And so they represent kind of that day-to-day existence. And that's how I included them. There are 9 in North America. There are 2 in Latin America, and there are 4 in Europe. And you can see the names on the screen, and I'm going to go through them briefly, each one. Just as a point of reference, from the smallest population to the largest, especially when we talk about walkability, I think it's interesting to connect. The smallest place I lived was a village in Costa Rica, which is called Pacayas, which was an agricultural village. And the largest, I think, London may count, Bogota might be in there, but there's a range from 5,000 to about 9 million people in the various places that I've lived. When I'm thinking about walkability, and I decided again to make this presentation a little bit autobiographical, I still wanted to have kind of an analytical lens through which to kind of think about these places. And this is a reflection of kind of how my work, both on local government services, but also in the context of well-being, how walkability has become increasingly a big part of how I think about livability and well-being in communities. And so one aspect is the physical things that support walkability. And for me, those include proximity. So geographic proximity, how close you are to the places you would like to go, whether they be amenities, schools, work, etc., as most of us have studied quite extensively. In support of walkability also has to be accessibility. And by this, I mean, even if you are in proximity to places, can you get there safely walking? And typically things that I run into that prohibit this might include large, busy streets, poor pavements or spaces that are difficult to cross, or things like train tracks if trains are left there, or things like there's any variety of those things you can think of that might pose a problem, and they're different in different places. Also important in terms of the physical aspects of walkability for me is the connectivity. So within the walkable place you are, when you are at the end of that walkability, or if you are not quite there, but you need to get to a place that is more walkable, is there a way to connect there? And by that, I am looking at any kind of transit that might be shared, as well as shared bikes, shared rides. And I would even include in that category a personal vehicle if the personal vehicle is only occasionally used and is not the predominant mode of travel. And I think it comes to my mind in some places in Europe, you can see where you might connect to a city, a small city, and then there's parking. And then when you go into the city, you no longer use the car. And so I consider the personal car not the primary, but one of the ways that you might connect in walkable areas. Next, I'd like to include the sociocultural aspects of walkability, because for me, as I've looked at this extensively, I find that they may even overtake in terms of our areas of concern, the physical aspects of walkability. And I include in this expectation. And by this, I mean, does the person or the caretaker of people, whether it's children or maybe elder adults or things, people in your network and you yourself, is there an expectation that you should be able to walk? Is it acceptable to you to be able to walk if the physical conditions are correct? I think that's an important thing. And I think personal mobility has something to do with our expectation and what thing we will choose. Safety in terms of sociocultural aspects, I'm thinking here about not just the physical infrastructure, which we talk about a lot, but I'm thinking rather about, do I perceive it as safe for myself to walk even if the physical infrastructure is there? And this may vary extensively by person. It might have something to do with your age. It might have something to do with the community you're in, whether or not the community permits safe walking, if that's considered a normal activity. And I include a memoji of myself here because I think each of us have to think about our own, again, age. It might be our race. It might be our condition. It might be the environment in everything. Our walkable experience is different for different people in different, even in the same places. So safety, whether I perceive it to be safe to walk. And the last one I include here is status. And by this, I mean, is the society in which I'm living, and that might be the street I live on, it might be my whole neighborhood, it could be the whole city, is walking, first of all, acceptable, but second of all, is walking, what status is conveyed by walking? Do you receive a low status by society? Is it kind of neutral that you walk? Or do you get some high points, you get a higher status? And so each society has different things that send its cues in terms of social status. And I think walking is one that needs to be looked at in terms of status as well, and helps, it contributes to how we determine whether or not we walk. So to kind of, I'm going to walk through briefly. So I'm using those 6 aspects as kind of a measure for each of the places I've lived. And then I'm also using this personal pie chart, a personal mobility pie, to kind of reflect how much I walked or used other kinds of travel in that specific location. So to start, as I grew up in Saginaw, Michigan. When I was growing up there, it was a city of about 90,000 people, and it's a county region with about 200,000 people. And at the time, this was like most of the industry there, the main industry was connected to the automobile industry. And so there were some factories in the outlying areas, and there were some headquarters for what is now called Delphi, with Saginaw Steering Care when I lived there. Anyway, I lived in a walkable area. I walked to school and to stores from the time I was about 4 or 5 years old. I walked all the years to school, and I went to school with some of the same people from first grade to high school. And my school was about 3 city blocks, so 500 meters. Our public library and other amenities such as a shopping department store were about another 500 meters, so less than a half a mile. And so walkability was a key part of my growing up. And within a mile radius, we had a big park and other amenities, pool, etc. The Y. So really, there was no need to drive as I was a student. That driving came into play when I got a job. When I was 14, I needed a ride. It was outside that walkable area. And as far as buses were concerned, our school provided rides to things that were further outside our area. And then we use the city bus occasionally for the going to the mall that was outside that area. So the reason I wanted to emphasize Saginaw is I think that foundational walkability really set the tone for me in terms of my relationship to walking, which I think is different from peers and is less and less the norm for people in North America as we go through time. I'm talking about the 70s and early 80s. And as we go into later years, as people have had less and less of this opportunity, the school I went to just to demonstrate was closed, and all of my siblings younger than me had to commute to school about 8 miles away. And so that they had a completely different childhood experience because of that. The next place that I went and I lived was on Kalamazoo College's campus in Kalamazoo, Michigan. On that campus, I would describe this as kind of an ideal or easy walkability. I didn't really think about it at the time when I decided to go to this school. I was more interested in the international programs, but then I realized that it was providing me the exact same thing I had at home. I could wake up, brush my teeth, and be in class within 10 minutes. And so for all 4 years there, I reinforced that walkability because the cars were all on the perimeter. The school was in a walkable neighborhood. I had about a mile walk to the downtown if I needed to go to something beyond campus. But meals and everything were provided on campus, so it was very walkable in that sense. And I did not need to rely on much other transit options. And the neighborhood behind the campus, similar to the neighborhood I grew up in, was a traditional neighborhood developed prior to the automobile being a priority. So it had a lot of walkability in it as well. During my studies, I went to Bogota, Colombia, and I also went to Pacayas, Costa Rica. Bogota I was studying, and in Pacayas I was doing research for my thesis. And I would like to comment that Bogota, as you saw on my list, is one of the biggest cities I lived in. But my livability there was based on living in kind of a semi-suburban style residential area called Pontevedra, which you can see the house kind of demonstrating what it looked like. And then I had to commute 45 minutes by bus to the central city of Bogota, which is quite a distance for my classes. The walkability and the transit I experienced there, the bus took over as the main mode of travel because of the distance. But I still had a lot of walkability in my immediate neighborhood where I could go out with friends and that sort of thing without needing transit. And then once I was in the central city, I also had access to walkability in that sense. Bogota was interesting. It was a very intense experience as a big city. And I would say on a safety level, it had a medium to low safety for a couple of reasons. One, as a foreigner and a young woman there, like if I would try to go jogging or something when they had ciclovia, like closed streets, people would kind of actually chase me, not in an overly aggressive manner, but enough to make me hesitate in terms of my mobility. But it didn't deter me much except for the running aspect. So overall, a reasonably good experience. And then Bogota, of course, has changed tremendously since I was there and has much more access to mobility and probably much increased walkability as well. In Pacayas, that was a village, and there walking was quite expected because that was the norm. There was one made road coming into the city, the town. And then people lived in the village around a central plaza, which had, again, your normal amenities in terms of a church, a town hall, the city hall, and some little bit of shopping. There was a bus to the main regional city. And then the only time I really was in a car was when the farmers would give me a ride up to their farm. If I needed to interview people on the farm, I was able to do that. So that though both those places, while extremely different, reinforced walkability as an acceptable means of transit, especially as a student. I spent a couple years in Seattle, Washington, which is again a very different kind of city. And interestingly, I would assign this one kind of a title of reasonable walkability, but then a challenge for commuting. I lived in a walkable neighborhood, renting a room from some people, which you kind of see an overview here with the green trees. And you can see central Seattle kind of off in the horizon. And there's also a mountain in the picture. So I lived in a walkable neighborhood. So for my daily needs in terms of groceries, et cetera, I could get them from where I was. And there were other amenities in the neighborhood. But to get to work, I worked in a downtown law office initially, and I could take an express bus downtown, which was great. And I did that. And so again, I could connect my two walkable neighborhoods quite easily. Ironically, when I got a job more aligned with my profession, it was at a nonprofit organization between the downtown and where I lived and a little bit off the main line of the bus, and there was no way to get there with transit. And so it was kind of disrupted. And I ended up actually purchasing a vehicle, which was a surprise to me, but it was a need and I wanted to keep the job. And just reflecting on sometimes how the challenge of a vehicle cost can kind of disrupt a person's budget. I was on a relatively low budget at a nonprofit, and a quarter of my expenses were housing, a quarter devoted to the car, a quarter devoted to my school loan, and a quarter remaining for everything else, which was under $300 each quarter. And so that getting a car posed a problem. And I see that as sort of a message and a hair bringer on a lot of challenges we face in North America in terms of our mobility options. For my graduate studies, I was able to go to Bologna, Italy, and Washington, D.C. It was a 2-year program, and I was in both places for 1 year. Bologna, the city itself is quite walkable and pleasant with its porticos and such. And my classroom, which is in the higher picture, was in the central city. And then I lived outside of the medieval city walls in a kind of a more suburban area. I wasn't able to select the area, but it was a nice residential neighborhood, which again had amenities right at the doorstep in terms of groceries, et cetera. And then I typically would take the bus into class, and then I would commute back out. And there in Bologna, I would say walkability, even with their high car use, is quite accepted. And again, as a student, it was quite easy and safe. Even at night, it felt safe to be out and walking. So that was a good reinforcement of walkability. In contrast, when I came into Washington, D.C., felt a little bit less safe, and in terms of overall walkability, but I was able to choose where I lived, and I lived right across the street from my classes near DuPont Circle, which is in the picture there. And I was able to maintain kind of a walk lifestyle, and of course in DC with the metro and buses that help support that. When I started my full-time work, my sister and I decided to live together, and there I am at my front door. And again, we selected a location that had amenities nearby, emphasizing that. Washington, D.C., I was able to commute easily because of the metro. And so I was able to retain kind of that walkability in that work. And I had a personal vehicle, which I only reserve for longer distance travels. Budapest, Hungary, I moved there for work for a year. And I would say that Budapest really gave me the full, I would call it a full European experience, generalizing, of course, in terms of having supportive walkability in terms of the transit options. Initially, I lived in walking distance from work. Then my work moved, but the tram provided an easy switch in terms of a commute. And then there's the metro, and as well as taxis and other modes of travel that supported my walkability in Budapest. Other European places that I lived that again had comparable ease in support of walkability are Warsaw and London. London, I would say, was even more so than Warsaw, and I lived in them, of course, at different times. In London, the expansive transit is very helpful. And one thing I want to point out in London, which I found very interesting in terms of walkability, it was the most supportive wayfinding that I've ever experienced. And interestingly, the wayfinding there was set up to support people to not take the tube as frequently, the metro as frequently, and walk places instead. But I found it as someone who's prioritizing walking very helpful, as was a compass, because I found often people there were oriented towards tube stations and not actual destinations. And a compass combined with the wayfinding was very helpful. Warsaw, I actually ended up living and working in the same building, which wasn't exactly intentional. So that obviously supported a walkable lifestyle. And then the community itself has a lot of options, as Annika has written about a lot in terms of support for walkability. And so I found that very pleasant. I wanted to shout out regarding Detroit, Michigan, USA. Detroit in the US is obviously considered the motor city and has large emphasis on vehicles and driving. Much to my chagrin, like a lot of the downtown is devoted to parking, which a lot of us study quite extensively. But even with all the obstacles to walkability, there are certain there are neighborhood level as well as downtown and others where you can actually have a reasonable walkable lifestyle. And living there for a year, I was able to take advantage of that. And I have to say the People Mover, which is a monorail, supports walkability in the downtown very well. And I had access from where I was living to a couple different places for groceries, all of the amenities such as, opera and music theaters and museums, et cetera, in walking distance, as well as the waterfront, which we can see Canada in the background of the picture of the apartment building in the center. And so I had a very good experience living in central Detroit. Now for the little bit of a summary with the other American cities, which I hold in some regard as similar, even in places like Boulder, Colorado, which is kind of lauded for its bikeability and such. I found living there in 2 different locations during about a 10-year period that walking, while somewhat supported and actually even appreciated a lot in the right in the downtown area. That's an example where there's status for walking in a downtown, but then when you are outside the downtown, you might be perceived as someone who shouldn't be walking, like, why are you carrying your groceries kind of thing. And so I've had that experience both in Boulder as well as in Royal Oak, where I live now. And you can see this picture with the snow that people don't clear the sidewalks, which makes walking a challenge. It definitely shows it's not prioritized. And then in the picture where my brother is waving and my face is there, that's the sidewalk in front of my house. And I live two blocks, not even barely 2 blocks around the corner from a bakery. But to get to the bakery, I have to cross through this barren parking lot and then go around a corner. And to get to any other shops, there's a busy road there that feels very difficult to cross. So even though I'm in a walkable city and have proximity, some of the accessibility is hindered. In Miami, I lived in Coconut Grove. My husband and I chose to live right across the street from his office, again, because like all of these places, we set out to prioritize walkability and the shortest commute possible, including walking if it is feasible. And so within that Coconut Grove area, of course, we had a lot of walkability. Miami had some support for transit. But then just like most of the US, the car comes into play as needed for some further travel. So what kind of lessons learned have I had from all of this? I'll summarize this way. And again, that was a brief overview, just a little snapshot. Obviously, each of the places could be studied quite a bit. So my first lesson learned is that if you expect walkability, you can usually find it. Even in the United States, where the car is so prioritized, if you really want to walk, I have found that you can find neighborhoods that are reasonably walkable. And even if they're not perceived walkable by most people, you can also decide to walk. Proximity is essential for walkability. This is well established, obviously, in all of our studies, and I just mentioned it again. And I reinforce, because I think sometimes it's forgotten, if proximity does not have accessibility, you still don't have walkability. So yes, you can be close, but if it's not accessible, it's not walkable. As I mentioned at the beginning, connectivity, having transit or some other shared ride or shared bike within a walkable distance is needed for a fully walkable lifestyle. I think it's extremely important to emphasize that safety means something different to everyone and goes far beyond the infrastructure. The physical infrastructure is not the only piece of the puzzle when it comes to safety. Due to our sociocultural constraints, wherever we are located and wherever we travel, again, we have to consider racism, sexism, classism, any kind of othering that would say that walking is not the appropriate thing to do for a certain person, a certain age group, etc., diminishes walkability quite severely. And similar to that, the status conveyed by walking, whether it's high, neutral, or low, is complex and nuanced for each location and person. And when we're advocating for walkability, we need to focus on improving the status of walkability. How do I apply these lessons learned? And some of these a little bit reflect where I'm now living in Michigan and in North America, but I think they're applicable in most places. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is it's not the car itself, but our relationship to the car. How do we manage the car? How do we manage parking? How do we balance space for those walking and outside the vehicle versus those in the vehicle? And again, no cars, but not only cars all the time, everywhere. Again, any of us in North America know the domination is so strong, both embedded in our codes and our laws, as well as in our psyche. It's something that we have to contend with. When we're doing research about people's mobility modes, whether it's walkability or others, and this is an observation kind of the industry in general, when we look at planning and some of the engineering around travel, I like to encourage people to not only ask about the commute or a narrow one type of travel, or how they arrived at a certain meeting. I've seen this happen, but to rather ask about the many options that exist for their mobility, to see and to challenge people to see if they know, if I wanted to walk here, it is only 0.8 of a mile, or it's only 2 kilometers. If I wanted to come here a different way, I know there's a bus at the next block. I find that often people have no awareness of the options that are there for them. And again, in the US and maybe in Canada, this might be to an extreme, maybe Australia also, because the car domination is so strong that we overlook the other options even when they do exist. And this relates to building awareness and helping people shift, if not all of their trips away from an automobile or even from transit to walking, some of them. Again, this is just a kind of a norm or that I come to is human mobility is walkability. And when I say walkability, I should have said this at the beginning, I mean walking as well as assisted walking if someone needs a wheelchair or any kind of other assistance to have that kind of personal mobility. For me, language matters. I notice in a lot of the literature, the concept of mobility often leaves out walkability or rolling. And as we look into technology with AI and some of the autonomous vehicles, the concept of mobility is hijacked even further away from walking, is my observation. And so I think we need to work towards making sure walking is systemically included rather than excluded. The biggest barriers for me are the social-cultural norms more so than the physical constraints. And if we think about it, infrastructure and the funding for infrastructure follows status. And so rebalancing the status of walking and other modes of travel with driving, I think is something essential. And often with another pie example, I could see just moving some of our budget that's devoted to roads and streets towards walkability would make a huge difference for people's livability. And in that sense, also from a sociocultural perspective, if we're working on advocacy and we're working on communication around this topic, if we work to uplift those who are already walking, that will support the sociocultural norm of walkability. Again, in the case of here in Michigan, maybe other places in the US, so often people are maligned if they're walking, whether it's walking to the grocery store or we often talk about people not being able to afford or they're vulnerable. But actually, the truth is, for a well-being of the entire community, the people who are walking are the ones who are actually doing the biggest contribution to the community's well-being, whether being eyes on the street or whether being, again, not using a car or any other kind of transit. And so they're supporting us, and they deserve our support as well. So in that sense, I think we all should work towards creating a situation where walking is expected, walking is aspirational, walking is normal, and walking is preferred. It's a choice that people want to make for their mobility, and they look for it and they support those kind of communities. So with that, I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I would love to have a discussion with you now with your reflections and any comments you have on this kind of framework or just your experiences, and I look forward to it. And please be in touch via LinkedIn, or you can send me a message via my website. Appreciate it. So with that, I would love to hear any comments and questions or points, clarification, or just share your experiences on this related topic, which I know all of us kind of live and breathe more than most people.
Can I start, I guess?
Please.
Thank you so much. This definitely spoke very much to me. And I also grew up in the States in the 70s and 80s. And yeah, I walked everywhere, and that was the normal thing to do. And I actually lived in a reasonably sized city. My elementary school was closed, and we walked to the bigger school. And a good portion of my career, I used to train transportation planners, and I had the opportunity to travel a bit all over the world. And fortunately for me, the people I were training were more sort of, they were usually in downtown settings. So throughout all of my travels, like we never once rented a car. Like everywhere we went, even in the US, we always got around by foot or public transportation, basically. So I was very fortunate that happened. A few times I had funny experiences in cities like maybe, I don't know, Dallas or something, where we were staying in a hotel and we asked about nearby restaurants. And they sort of would give us suggestions under the assumption that we had a car. And, you know, when they started, you know, mentioning, oh, that's like a 10-minute drive, we say, no, we're walking. And when we get this reaction like, oh, you can't walk anywhere. And we're like, oh, we can. And normally, I mean, there were one or two times that it actually was, you know, a not pleasant walk, and a few times where, like in Bellevue, I remember Washington across from Seattle, we could not find the restaurant that someone had told us about because it was oriented towards the parking lot behind an office building. And there was like no obvious indication like where it might have been, the entrance. Like they assumed that everyone came there by car. But anyway, just all this to say, like in my experience, yeah, most of the world you can walk in general. It may not be pleasant, like in Pakistan and places like that. You need to have your wits about you, and it's, but usually it's doable.
Yeah, those are great examples. Oh, excuse me.
Well, that's all.
Those are great examples of, again, that sociocultural bias that people are telling you to drive automatically, whereas, you know, you are trying to walk. And I've witnessed just recently a young couple trying to go into our local zoo, which is in walking distance from my house and many other houses. And the person at the gate couldn't understand that they didn't come in a car. And I said, well, there's homes nearby and there's a bus stop. So they probably just came from home. Anyway, it was a big confusion. Other comments or questions? Yes, Barb. Oh, you're muted.
Okay, I was so noisy at the beginning, I was double muted. I have a phone and my device. Sorry about that. Annika commented too that she loved the personal mobility pie. I really, really like that. And maybe like you could, if you were a transit planner, you could use it to talk about transit and use all these same concepts. I'm curious about how you used that in working with people or communities to think about what options are available. And then kind of springboarding from that, I started thinking about if I'm somebody who hasn't thought about walking, but you had me do a pie of things that matter to me, family time, health, other things, I could then draw lines and say, oh, so if you walked to school with your child, you're getting healthy walking and family time. So you could connect the mobility pie to pies of other things. So just curious if you could talk more about how you've used that.
Interestingly, I have used it mostly in this type of analysis myself. I would like to start doing it with communities and with planning agencies and such, because I think it's an easy to use concept. And the other thing I was thinking about that I wanted to reinforce, and I said a little bit at the beginning, that in this presentation, I'm focusing on my personal experience, but my own father or mother might have a different experience, even though they're in the same household. And then also what I think would be extremely interesting is you could easily do, which many planners do in a different format, look at the overall city's pie. Like the city might have a distribution of use. And again, my hometown, even though I was walking, might have had even then a distribution of people making 50% of their journeys by car or whatever it was you could establish, and then toggle between the difference. I feel like one of the biggest challenges is this kind of mental block we have about the usability of walkability. And I kind of think that unfolds it a little bit. And I love the way you were saying to even relate it to maybe well-being or other aspects like that. So if you're interested in working on something like that, I'd love to talk more about it, because I would like to create both workshops. And I've actually also thought about it would be something you could actually pretty easily, and it's funny because I'm a very low tech person, but I could see where you could take a picture with your phone of an intersection, and that could almost be translated into what does it provide for, what is the pie it provides? And that one by my house is I've done a couple of videos also when I cross it. It's so absurd, and it's right next to businesses and homes, and we just have so many of them that I think it would help clarify some of those obstacles. Anyway, so that's kind of where I'm at with that. It's kind of in progress. And the other six
Yeah.
factors I have, I'm also thinking about how those might be a framework a little bit for analysis. So anyway, other
Yeah.
questions or comments?
The other thing
Go ahead, please.
that occurred, one more thing that occurred to me about the pie was you could be calculating that as miles, as time, as trips. So which were you using when you developed your percentages? Because all of those matter.
I was thinking more about not distance, but rather like the number of trips that fall into that category. So my first choice, what would be my first choice? That's the way I was thinking about it. Not actual time, because that would shift quite a bit, but rather my first choice. Or the one I took, I suppose I should say, in sheer numbers. So if there's 90 trips or 100 trips, then 80 of them were walking, and like that kind of breakdown, regardless of distance. Go ahead, Blair. Nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you too. Thanks. And I loved your the 6 categories. It's a great way of talking about this and understanding it. It's really wonderful. And also like the mental block about walking. I remember when I was younger, I'd have some friends and we would joke that, just building that expectation that everything's in walking distance if you have enough time, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about ways you found or thoughts around raising the status of walking. I think you're absolutely right that the status, I live in New York, so the status of walking, everybody walks regularly everywhere, and it's great. And yeah, raising the status of this is such an important thing, and it can be a difficult one because it's a very different challenge than a lot of what we're used to doing. So I wonder if you have any, thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought a lot about it, and I feel like there should be almost couple different things. Number one, the kind of public information campaigns, public like the local heroes. This came to my mind several years ago when I had attended a breakfast for it was like small organizations and people who were doing work for some better sustainability and ecological practices. And there was a lot of discussion about kids who had to walk to school, and kids who didn't have a bus to get to some events and things. And I was just thinking about how we in society pity people who don't have the options, but rather we should be actually either literally like, applauding them or paying them. And I was reaching out to this organization, or I was even thinking with schools. I mean, kids who walk to school instead of riding a bus should get something every day positive for that, because it is a challenge, right? And actually they're doing us a favor by not being driven to school or not when they're in proximity. Of course, in some cases that's not, possible. So that's how I've thought about it. I have not actually implemented a project like that. I would love to again, engage with either a community or some organizations. I see as far as falling into this category a little bit, maybe the safe routes to school type work, some of the work, this is not walking, but biking with the bike, what are they called? Bike buses when kids are taking, when we're trying to break down those barriers. I think some of those fall into that same category. But if we give people free parking, why don't we pay them to walk to work? It's like, what? And I've had this fight in my city because again, I'm on the planning commission and the sustainability task force and things. And people come to the meetings about the parking. And we're in a very walkable area by US standards, for sure. Many people live in walking distance to our amenities. But no matter what it is, everyone's always talking about the parking. And it's like, wait a minute, when I come and I walk to your store, I don't complain about parking. And so you're ignoring me. You're ignoring me because I'm not complaining. So how do we flip this? And then one other anecdotal or real example, my brothers ran a nonprofit theater in Minneapolis for a long time. And they used to give people like a $2 bill if they walked or biked to their theater. And again, this is just, as a whatever, but just to kind of expand the acknowledgement and that sort of thing. So those are some examples in that category. But I encourage all of us to think in those categories, because we have got to shift this narrative, because we have to put it into a status that's high. And it is in that status. Sometimes you're in a fancy neighborhood, a fancy downtown, but that's not the same as the day-to-day walkability and usability. Any other comments or questions? How are we doing on time? I think we have about 10 minutes left. Reflections on your own experience with some of these issues in your projects or in your own. Again, New York is probably the outlier in the whole US where people walk way more. And they're slimmer because of it. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, if nobody else has any comments. I just want another point that, especially in the US and certain other, it's like you need places to walk to. Like you need a mixed use. Like that's really a really crucial element that is lacking in much of the US, for example. Like even if you create a pleasant walking environment, if there's no particular destinations to go to, then so this is a challenge in how to recreate these 15-mile cities, which has now become
15 minutes, not miles.
Yeah.
We have too many 15-mile cities.
Yeah, no, 15 minutes. Yes. But it's become like politicized, sort of like, it's like a woke conspiracy. And anyway, it's yeah. So yeah, I mean, you hinted at all these things in your graphics about accessibility, actually. That sort of includes access to destinations
And what's
and
really
schools.
Yeah, for sure. And what's really funny to me, or not funny, but strange, is again, even in a place where things are proximate and there are places to walk to, the overwhelming suburban mentality that's superimposed on top of those places creates this kind of distortion that people cannot see how close things are. And so like another thing I do, and then I've suggested to people, and actually I suggested in the Walkability Economy group here through our network, is set your phone to walk and see how close things are. Check the walk distance before you even go anywhere. Because sometimes it's like, whoa, that's only right there. I have a museum near me here that's less than a mile away. And because it's on a busy street, it seems like it's really far away. But when I walked there, I was like, wow, it's so close. And so there's lots of examples of that. And again, the accessibility really breaks the proximity, which again, we see in worst case in our suburban layouts, but even in city layouts, just because of the car speeds, we see that repeated. Robert, please.
Yeah, no, that was a great presentation, and I really enjoyed it. And definitely, obviously, none of the stuff is surprising to us, but yes, unfortunately, to many out there, it may be. But I guess just extending upon what Zvi said before, like I grew up in Toronto, so I walked everywhere. Like that was just normal. My dad did not have a driver's license at all in his whole life. He died without having a driver's license. So there's not many North Americans that probably can say that. So because he took the subway or walked, to work every day. So it's normal for me. But yeah, I had friends later on in life who I met who lived in suburbia, and obviously to them walking was strange. And yeah, I was a strange person because why would you walk when you could take the car? But I guess this is where it comes down to the fact that because I work for a city, so obviously it's our responsibility. In addition to people being adventurous and taking up the gauntlet and going for a walk, so we need to build better streets, for God's sakes. Like our streets are pathetic in most of North American cities, minus obviously the big cities that we've talked about already. But even New York and even Montreal and even Toronto, yes, downtown's great. The rest of the city's crap. It's not very walkable. If you go outside of the central part of those cities, suburbia is suburbia no matter where you go in New World cities. It's awful. And then you also mentioned when you talked about accessibility, you were referring to the term accessibility as obviously being able just to get to the place. But obviously from my focus, a lot is on universal design, right? It's making sure, that, people of all ages and abilities are able to access that. And that's what I notice in a lot of the projects that here at the city of Edmonton and other projects I've worked at other cities where I've worked in the past, it's that we still, even though we have a lot of policies and great documents, we're creating these supposed walkable environments, and they are relatively walkable to a lot of people, but not to everybody. And so we got to make sure that we're thinking about all users, and I'm not just talking about people with visual impairments or people in wheelchairs or mobility scooters, talking about people with dementia, people with other learning disabilities. Like, there's a lot of things that we don't think about on a day-to-day basis that we need to do a better job at. So yeah, I'll shut up now and let others talk.
No, I appreciate that a lot. And definitely, I was referring to accessibility in both ways. I didn't really say it maybe as clearly as I should. And I 100% agree. And the reason I pulled it back to even just crossing the street, because even for someone who's able-bodied, there's obstacles at a very short distance. And so that was what I was thinking. And the other thing I want to mention with regard to suburbia, which I find interesting, is there are places and there are ways, even in the most bizarrely car-oriented suburbias, to reconnect cul-de-sacs or to make the walking paths. And even though there are strip malls, you can't, if someone is a walkably oriented person, as Zveen mentioned his experience in Dallas, and I've done in other places, we will walk along all of those parking lots, which everyone else is driving, to get to a different destination. And so there is a way to connect it, but again, we have to completely change our mentality. And the other comment I want to say about that is I listened to the gentleman from Tihi, Poland, that Annika had on the other day, and he was saying he's in charge of pedestrian, he's like the liaison and a planner. And he said what I thought was very interesting, because this does not happen, I think, in North America. And Mario, I acknowledge you have your hand up, and I'm coming to you right in a minute. He was saying, if you ask people what they want, they'll say they want to drive. Some might walk anyway, and so you have to make it walkable, even though people haven't said they want it. And I think we struggle in the US that we keep waiting for everyone to raise their hand. Yes, we want a transit. Yes, we want. It's like, no. We need to plan better cities for everyone, taking into consideration whether they're at the meeting or not at the meeting. And so I've been also thinking a lot about how we should have a community profile up front in every public meeting and say, yes, you came to the meeting today, but we're making decisions about all these other people as well, because we have to somehow get away from that just because you scream, you get what you want type thing. Although if we scream for walkability, I think we should get what we want. Mario, please go ahead. Mario, are you still with us? You might be muted. Oh, there you go. Come on.
I had to go out. I wanted to give you congratulate you for your presentation, but I'm in the street, so it might not work out. But if you can hear me.
Go ahead.
Yes,
we hear you well. Go ahead. We can hear
okay, good. So I can even switch on for. I have the privilege to be in the spring in Paris, so that's what I wanted to give you that. But anyway, one thing I wanted to also highlight is how boring and how exciting the route is. Because when the route is boring, people tend to perceive that walking takes longer. When the route is exciting and there is window shopping, things like that, and children playing and people watching, is much shorter than it really is. So that's just asking if you also perceive that way or not. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comment. And I would say 120%. And what I love to, some of the examples can be people who say they don't walk in their local neighborhood will say they walked 20,000 steps when they go to Paris, or they go to New York, or they go to Disneyland, and they don't use their car for a whole week. And so somehow people actually have the experience and understanding that they can walk. But then when they're in certain areas, they don't do it at all. And it's like an all or nothing kind of extreme. And so I think the pleasure of the walk obviously has a lot to do with that. Along with, again, the sociocultural pressure that's put on not walking, and some other factors. But so I appreciate that. And I love your lovely Paris walking view. The weather looks great too.
Just wanted to give you this lovely alley that I'm walking in. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mario. Anyone else who hasn't chimed in have anything to comment? Uli or Mohammed or Anika or anyone else?
I will jump in. I don't know how to raise my hand. I think it's because I'm the host. I'm not sure I can, but I want to say, first of all, thank you. This was, I love this. This is the first type of session we've had with, I love the way you did it with your, first of all, your incredible life experience so far in all these places. I think we could host several evenings of chats, and maybe it'll inspire other network members to do similar things, even just from travels. You know, I think I just love the presentation. I love your personal mobility pie. And speaking of love, I'm actually inspired to, as if I don't already do, maybe have enough projects on my plate, I would like to start a campaign, fall in love with walking. The question that Blair asked, I can't remember specifically what it was, but the question she asked you about how do we shift that? And, you know, as I like media so much, I was thinking, you know, campaigns are nice. And I think you referenced that as well. And I love, first of all, listening to your presentation, it's obvious. I think we're in the company here of many people who work with these issues, but who are also love walking at heart. They're walkers, right? It's in our spirit. Many of us, I think, in this network. And I think that's sometimes the passion too, that some people are like, don't even know that they have, because you just grow up, especially if you grow up car dependent, you don't even know you have that passion. So now I live in Warsaw. I often get off, to my kids' chagrin sometimes, I often get off the bus like a few stops even early because I want the walk, you know what I mean? Like, so I'll even like get off early just to take that walk. And I think for a lot of people who are not used to walking or not used to just like, what? Like, you don't even, you know? But I love the idea. Maybe it can be a network activity too, a fall in love with walking campaign where we get down to the heart of things with, you know, what connects us to this activity too.
And also on this, this is kind of a lot of different things, obviously in here and kind of intense in terms of the content. And so I'm happy to, again, if there's something we should hone in on or either have just a follow-up discussion or a topic to explore more, I'm happy to do that. I love the idea of falling in love with walking. That's great. When I worked in Poland and we worked on, I worked on those kind of mass campaigns too. So that's a great idea. What was the other thing I was going to say? And the mobility pie, yeah, I'm happy to keep working on that and expanding its application and getting it into some communities as well. Uli, did you want to say something? Oh,
Yes, I would like to say something. Do you hear me well?
yes, yes.
Just because I'm like Mario at the streets walking. Actually, I have my bike right now. I'm returning home. And I found very interesting your presentation. I think that those charts that you create, these pizza charts, are awesome. And Barb just asked the question that I have in mind: how do you create it? I think that it's well explained. And I had something in my mind while you presented your presentation that actually I at the campus UNB, the university that I have my studies, and it's actually 30 minutes by bike from where I live. And I live in the center right now. It's pretty far for those who are walking. So I think that with all these things that you said about accessibility, well-structured cities for walking, there is this thing of context, because Brasilia has this widespread city that everything is far, far away from home, even downtown, even in the center, everything is far away from home. And my block, my house is situated in a place that have pharmacies, supermarkets, but the university is far away. So there is this thing that schools are far away, hospitals are far away. So the context gives us a lot to think of when we talk about pedestrianization, walkability. That's it. There's just a reflection that came into my mind.
Yeah, That's great. And that context definitely makes a lot of difference. And in some places it may not, the distance may not be able to be overcome for sure. And I wonder in some place like Brasilia, eventually whether or not they will start to try to fill in the mixed use. But if not, the connectivity from place to place, whether it's a bike or some other mode or means is definitely essential. Speaking of like other places and thinking about other places I've been, like I would say the least walkable places I've been were probably Jakarta because of the traffic and such, and they're going to try to build a new capital and change all of that, which will be interesting to see what happens. And then maybe Riyadh because of the heat. And so it is interesting to see every context does have to be taken into consideration. But whatever is the least impactful and the most healthful for both the community and for the individuals, to me should be hopefully prioritized, as again, most of us already agree. So anyway, well, I appreciate your attention. I don't know, Annika, I think, are you trying to keep these to 1 hour? Happy to discuss later. I'd love everyone to connect via LinkedIn or via my website. Oh, go ahead, Merv.
Hi, my connection was bad, so I thought maybe it's continuing. That's why I wanted to join to see if it's still there. If
We can
the
hear you now.
presentation-
I'm not sure. Did you have a question?
Oh, no. I just want to touch with the presentation, but I guess it's over.
Oh, sorry. There is a recording though, so that will be posted.
Oh, okay. Yes, I will watch it from there then. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Merve in Istanbul, really briefly, Anna, I do want to also say, I'm sure you've noticed from the chat, we had, I won't list all the places, but we had members joining from 7 countries and 12 cities. Really exciting. And yes, I will be publishing this. And when I post it on LinkedIn, I'll be tagging everybody that was in the video too, so everybody can link up as well.
That's great. So again, I appreciate everyone's participation. I look forward to further connection and discussion. And again, on any of the topics, if there's further follow-up, let's stay in touch. And great. Let's love walking more.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank
If
you
you
all.
ever want to host a future session or lead an activity, of course, more than welcome. Everybody knows in the network they're welcome to lead correspondence session. This was, I believe, one of the first correspondence sessions this year. We're having a series, so we're really kicking it up. So please feel welcome. Thank you so much, Anne.
Maybe I'll structure one as we talked about a while back on the mobility pie, and we can talk about that a little bit further, maybe some of its applications.
That's going to be really popular.
I'll challenge myself to do that in the like set something in the for the summer. That would be good.
People will really love that, I think. So that'd be great.
That's right, Barb. Who doesn't? Whether it's pizza or fruit pie, all cream pie, all the pies. All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day, everybody.